everyone, welcome back to Mental Wealth Reads. We're going to continue with Man's Search for Meaning. We should be able to get through to the next little section here, I think. Yeah, we should be fine with it. Oh, we actually are going to finish the section. Yay! Okay, so this is part 5 of section 1. We're going to start where we left off, and it looks to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7... about 7 pages. So we're going to actually finish this section here, which is going to be awesome. Cannot wait. Alright, let's go. The tender beginnings of a psychotherapy or psychohygiene were, when they were possible at all in the camp, either individual or collective in nature. The individual psychotherapeutic attempts were often a kind of life-saving procedure. These efforts were usually concerned with the prevention of suicides. A very strict camp ruling forbade any efforts to save a man who attempted suicide. It was forbidden, for example, to cut down a man who was trying to hang himself. Therefore, it was all important to prevent these attempts from occurring. I remember 2 cases of would-be suicide, which bore a striking similarity to each other. Both men had talked of their intentions to commit suicide. Both used the typical argument they had nothing more to expect from life. In both cases, it was a question of getting them to realize that life was still expecting something from them. Something in the future was expected of them. We found, in fact, that for one, it was his child whom he adored, and who was waiting for him in a foreign country. For the other, it was a thing, not a person. This man was a scientist and had written a series of books which still needed to be finished. His work could not be done by anyone else, any more than another person could ever take the place of the father in his child's affections. His uniqueness and singleness, which distinguishes each individual and gives a meaning to his existence, was a bearing on creative work as much as it does on human love. When the impossibility of replacing a person is released, it allows the responsibility which a man has for his existence and its continuance to appear in all its magnitude. A man who becomes conscious of the responsibility he bears towards a human being who affectionately waits for him, or to an unfinished work, will never be able to throw away his life. He knows the why for his existence, and will be able to bear almost any how. The opportunities for collective psychotherapy were naturally limited in camp. The right example was more effective than the words could ever be. A senior block warden who did not side with the authorities had, by his just and encouraging behavior, 1,000 opportunities to exert a far-reaching moral influence on those under his jurisdiction. The immediate influence of behavior is always more effective than that of words. But at times a word was effective too, when mental receptiveness had been intensified by some other circumstances. I remember an incident when there was occasion for psychotherapeutic work on the inmates of a whole hut due to an intensification of their receptiveness because of a certain external situation. It had been a bad day. On parade, the announcement had been made about the many actions that would, from then on, be regarded as sabotage and therefore punishable by immediate death by hanging. Among these were crimes such as cutting small strips from our old blankets in order to improvise ankle supports, and very minor thefts. A few days previously, a semi-starved prisoner had broken into the potato store to steal a few pounds of potatoes. The theft had been discovered and some prisoners had recognized the burglar. When the camp authorities heard about it, they offered that the guilty man be given up to them or the whole camp would starve for a day. Naturally, the 2,500 men preferred to fast. On the evening of this day of fasting, we lay in our earthen huts in a very low mood. Very little was said and every word sounded irritable. Then, to make matters even worse, the light went out. Tempers reached their lowest ebb, but our senior block warden was a wise man. He improvised a little talk about all that was on our minds at that moment. He talked about the many comrades who had died in the last few days, either of sickness or of suicide. But he also mentioned what may have been the real reason for their deaths, giving up hope. He maintained that there should be some way of preventing possible future victims from reaching this extreme state. And it was to me that the warden pointed to give this advice. God knows I was not in the mood to give psychological explanations or to preach any sermons, to offer my comrades a kind of medical care to their souls. I was cold and hungry, irritable and tired, but I had to make the effort to use this unique opportunity. Encouragement was now more necessary than ever. So I began by mentioning the most trivial of comforts first. I said that even in this Europe, in the 6th winter of the Second World War, our situation was not the most terrible we could think of. I said that each of us had to ask himself what irreplaceable losses he had suffered up to then. I speculated that for most of them, these losses had really been few. Whoever was still alive had reason for hope. Health, family, happiness, professional abilities, fortune, position in society, all these were things that could be achieved again or restored. After all, we had all our bones intact. Whatever we had gone through could still be an asset to us in the future. And I quoted Nietzsche. And I quoted from Nietzsche. That which does not kill me makes me stronger. Then I spoke about the future. I said that to the impartial future must seem hopeless. I agreed that each of us could guess for himself how small were his chances of survival. I told them that although there was still no typhus epidemic in the camp, I estimated my own chances at about 1 in 20. But I also told them that, in spite of this, I had no intention of losing hope and giving up. For no man knew what the future would bring, much less the next hour. Even if we could not expect any sensational military events in the next few days, who knew better than we, with our experience of camps, how great chances sometimes opened up, quite suddenly, at least for the individual. For instance, one might be attached unexpectedly to a special group with especially good working conditions, for this was the kind of thing which constituted the luck of the prisoner. But I did not only talk of the future and the veil which was drawn over it. I also mentioned the past, all its joys, and how its light shone even in the present darkness. Again I quoted a poet, to avoid sounding like a preacher myself, who had written, "What you have experienced, no power on earth can take from you." Not only our experiences, but all we have done, whatever great thoughts we may have, and all we have suffered, all this is not lost, though it is past. We have brought it into being. Having been is also a kind of being, and perhaps the surest kind. Then I spoke of the many opportunities of giving life a meaning. I told my comrades, who lay motionless, although occasionally a sigh could be heard, that human life, under any circumstances, never ceases to have a meaning, and that this infinite meaning of life includes suffering and dying, privation and death. I asked the poor creatures who listened to me attentively in the darkness of the hut to face up to the seriousness of our position. They must not lose hope, but should keep their courage in the certainty that the hopelessness of our struggle did not detract from its dignity and its meaning. I said that someone looks down on each of us in difficult hours, a friend, a wife, somebody alive or dead, or a God, and he would not expect us to disappoint him. He would hope to find us suffering proudly, not miserably, knowing how to die. And I finally spoke of our sacrifice, which had meaning in every case. It was in the nature of this sacrifice that it should appear to be pointless in the normal world, the world of material success. But in reality, our sacrifice did have a meaning. Those of us who had any religious faith, I said frankly, could understand without difficulty. I told them of a comrade who on his arrival in camp had tried to make a pact with heaven that his suffering and death should have saved the human being he loved from a painful end. For this man, suffering and death were meaningful. His was a sacrifice of the deepest significance. He did not want to die for nothing. None of us wanted that. The purpose of my words was to find a full meaning in our life, then and there, in that hut and in that practically hopeless situation. I saw that my efforts had been successful. When the electric bulb flared up again, I saw the miserable figures of my friends limping toward me to thank me, with tears in their eyes. But I have to confess here that only too rarely had I the inner strength to make contact with my companions in suffering, and that I must have missed many opportunities for doing so. We now come to the third stage of a prisoner's mental reactions, the psychology of the prisoner after his liberation. But prior to that, we shall consider a question which the psychologist is asked frequently, especially when he has personal knowledge of these matters. What can you tell us about the psychological makeup of the camp guards? How is it possible that men of flesh and blood could treat others as so many prisoners say they have been treated? Having once heard these accounts, and having come to believe that these things did happen, one is bound to ask how, psychologically, they could happen. To answer this question, without going into detail, a few things must be pointed out. First, among the guards, there were some sadists in the purest clinical sense. Second, these sadists were always selected when a really severe detachment of guards was needed. There was great joy at our work site when we had permission to warm ourselves for a few minutes, after 2 hours of work in the bitter frost, in front of a little stove which was fed with twigs and scraps of wood. But there were always some foremen who found a great pleasure in taking this comfort from us. How clearly their faces reflected this pleasure when they not only forbade us to stand there, but turned over the stove and dumped its lovely fire into the snow. When the SS took a dislike to a person, there was always some special man in their ranks known to have a passion for and to be highly specialized in sadistic torture, to whom the unfortunate prisoner was sent. Third, the feelings of the majority of the guards had been dulled by the numbers of years in which, in ever-increasing doses, they had witnessed the brutal methods of the camp. These morally and mentally hardened men at least refused to take active part in the sadistic measures, but they did not prevent others from carrying them out. Fourth, it must be stated that even among the guards were some who took pity on us. I shall only mention the commander of the camp from which I was liberated. It was found after the liberation, only the camp doctor, a prisoner himself, had known of it previously, that this man had paid no small sum of money from his own pocket in order to purchase medicines for his prisoners from the nearest market town. But the senior camp warden, a prisoner himself, was harder than any of the SS guards. He beat up other prisoners at every slightest opportunity, while the camp commander, to my knowledge, never once lifted his hand against any of us. It is apparent that the mere knowledge that a man was either a camp guard or a prisoner tells us almost nothing. Human kindness can be found in all groups, even those which as a whole it would be easy to condemn. The boundaries between groups overlapped, and we must not try to simplify matters by saying that these men were angels and those were devils. Certainly, it was a considerable achievement for the guard or foreman to be kind to the prisoners in spite of all the camp's influences, and on the other hand, the baseness of a prisoner who treated his own companions badly was exceptionally contemptible. Obviously, the prisoners found the lack of character in such men especially upsetting, while they were profoundly moved by the smallest kindness received from any of the guards. I remember how one day a foreman secretly gave me a piece of bread which I knew he must have saved from his breakfast ration. It was far more than the small piece of bread which moved me to tears at the time. It was the human something which this man also gave me, the word and look which accompanied the gift. From all this we may learn that there are two races of men in this world, but only these two, the race of the decent man and the race of the indecent man. Both are found everywhere. They penetrate into all groups of society. No group consists entirely of decent or indecent people. In this sense, no group is of a pure race, and therefore one occasionally found a decent fellow among the camp guards. Life in a concentration camp tore open the human soul and exposed its depths. And is it surprising that in those depths we again found only human qualities which in their very nature were a mixture of good and evil? The rift dividing good from evil, which goes through all human beings, reaches into the lowest depths and becomes apparent even on the bottom of the abyss which is laid open by the concentration camp. And now to the last chapter in the psychology of the concentration camp. The psychology of the prisoner who has been released. In describing the experiences of liberation, which naturally must be personal, we shall pick up the threads of that part of our narrative which told of the morning when the white flag was hoisted above the camp gates, after days of high tension. This state of inner suspense was followed by total relaxation, but it would be quite wrong to think that we went mad with joy. What then did happen? With tired steps, we prisoners dragged ourselves to the camp gates. Timidly, we looked around and glanced at each other questioningly. Then we ventured a few steps out of the camp. This time no orders were shouted at us, nor was there any need to duck quickly to avoid a blow or kick. Oh no, this time the guards offered us cigarettes. We hardly recognized them at first. They had hurriedly changed into civilian clothes. We walked slowly along the road leading from the camp. Soon our legs hurt and threatened to buckle, but we limped on. We wanted to see the camp surrounding for the first time with the eyes of free men. Freedom, we repeated to ourselves, and yet we could not grasp it. We had said this word so often during all the years we dreamed about it, that it had lost its meaning. Its reality did not penetrate into our consciousness. We could not grasp the fact that freedom was ours. We came to the meadows full of flowers. We saw and realized that they were there, but we had no feelings about them. The first spark of joy came when we saw a rooster with a tail of multicolored feathers, but it remained only a spark. We did not yet belong to this world. In the evening, when we all met again in our hut, one said secretly to the other, "Tell me, were you pleased today?" And the other replied, feeling ashamed as he did not know that we all felt similarly, "Truthfully, no. We had literally lost the ability to feel pleased and had to relearn it slowly." Psychologically, what was happening to the liberated prisoners could be called depersonalization. Everything appeared unreal, unlikely, as in a dream. We could not believe it was true. How often in the past years had we been deceived by dreams? We dreamt that the day of liberation had come, that we had been set free, had returned home, greeted our friends, embraced our wives, sat down at the table, and started to tell of all the things we had gone through, even of how we had often seen the day of liberation in our dreams. And then a whistle shrilled in our ears, a signal to get up, and our dreams of freedom came to an end. And now the dream had come true. But could we truly believe in it? The body has fewer inhibitions than the mind. It made good use of the new freedom for the first moment on. It began to eat ravenously for hours and days, even half the night. It is amazing what quantities one can eat. And when one of the prisoners was invited out by a friendly farmer in the neighborhood, he ate, and then drank coffee, which loosened his tongue, and he began to talk, often for hours. The pressure which had been on his mind for years was released at last. Hearing him talk, one got the impression that he had to talk, that his desire to speak was irresistible. I have known people who have been under heavy pressure only for a short time, for example, through a cross-examination of the Gestapo, to have similar reactions. Many days passed until not only the tongue was loosened, but something within oneself as well. Then feeling suddenly broke through the strange fetters which had restrained it. One day, a few days after the liberation, I walked through the country past flowering meadows for miles and miles, toward the market town near the camp. Larks rose to the sky, and I could hear their joyous song. There was no one to be seen for miles around. There was nothing but the wide earth and sky, and the lark's jubilation, and the freedom of space. I stopped, looked around, and up to the sky, and then I went down on my knees. At that moment there was very little I knew of myself or of the world. I had but one sentence in mind, always the same. I called to the Lord from my narrow prison, and he answered me in the freedom of space. How long I knelt there and repeated this sentence, memory can no longer recall. But I know that on that day, in that hour, my new life started. Step for step, I progressed until I became a human being. The way that led from the acute mental tension of the last days in camp, from that war of nerves to mental peace, was certainly not free from obstacles. It would be an error to think that a liberated prisoner was not in need of spiritual care anymore. We have to consider that a man who has been under such enormous mental pressure for such a long time is naturally in some danger after his liberation, especially since the pressure was released quite suddenly. This danger, in the sense of psychological hygiene, is the psychological counterpart of the bends. Just as the physical health of the caisson worker would be endangered if he left his diver's chamber suddenly, where he is under enormous atmospheric pressure, so the man who has suddenly been liberated from mental pressure can suffer damage from his moral and spiritual health. During the psychological phase, one observed that people with natures of a more primitive kind could not escape the influences of the brutality which had surrounded them in camp life. Now being free, they thought they could use their freedom licentiously and ruthlessly. The only thing that had changed for them was that they are now the oppressors instead of the oppressed. They became instigators, not objects, of willful force and injustice. They justified their behavior by their own terrible experiences. This was often revealed in apparently insignificant events. A friend was walking across a field with me toward the camp when suddenly we came to a field of green crops. Automatically I avoided it, but he drew his arm through mine and dragged me through it. I stammered something about not treading down the young crops. He became annoyed, gave me an angry look, and shouted, "You don't say! And hasn't enough been taken from us? My wife and child have been gassed, not to mention everything else, and you would forbid me to tread on a few stalks of oats." Only slowly could these men be guided back to the commonplace truth that no one has the right to do wrong, not even if wrong has been done to them. We had to strive to lead them back to this truth, or the consequences would have been much worse than the loss of a few thousand stalks of oats. I can still see the prisoner who rolled up his shirt sleeves, thrust his right hand under my nose, and shouted, "May this hand be cut off if I don't stain it with blood on the day when I get home." I want to emphasize that the man who said these words was not a bad fellow. He had been the best of comrades in camp afterward. Apart from the moral deformity resulting from the sudden release of mental pressure, there were two other fundamental experiences which threatened to damage the character of the liberated prisoner. Bitterness and disillusionment when he returned to his former life. Bitterness was caused by a number of things he came up against in his former hometown. When on his return, a man found that in many places he was met only with a shrug of the shoulders and with hackneyed phrases. He tended to become bitter and to ask himself why he had gone through all that he had. When he heard the same phrases nearly everywhere, "We did not know about it," and "We too have suffered," then he asked himself, "Have they really nothing better to say to me?" The experience of disillusionment is different. Here it was not one's fellow man whose superficiality and lack of feeling was so disgusting that one finally felt like creeping into a hole and never hearing nor seeing human beings anymore, but fate itself, which seemed so cruel. A man who for years had thought he had reached the absolute limit of all possible suffering now found that suffering has no limits, and that he could suffer still more, and still more intensely. When we spoke about attempts to give a man in camp mental courage, we said that he had to be shown something to look forward to in the future. He had to be reminded that life still waited for him, and that a human being waited for his return. But after liberation, there were some men who found that no one awaited them. Woe to him who found that the person whose memory alone had given him courage in camp did not exist anymore. Woe to him who, when the day of his dreams finally came, found it so different from all he had longed for. Perhaps he boarded a trolley, traveled out to the home which he had seen for years in his mind, and only in his mind, and pressed the bell, just as he had longed to do in thousands of dreams, only to find that the person who should open the door was not there, and would never be there again. We all said to each other in camp that there could be no earthly happiness which could compensate for all we have suffered. We were not hoping for happiness. It was not that which gave us courage and gave meaning to our suffering, our sacrifices, and our dying. And yet we were not prepared for unhappiness. This disillusionment, which awaited not a small number of prisoners, was an experience which these men have found very hard to get over, and which, for a psychiatrist, is also very difficult to help them overcome. But this must not be a discouragement to him. On the contrary, it should provide an added stimulus. But for every one of the liberated prisoners, the day comes when, looking back on his camp experiences, he can no longer understand how he endured it all. As the day of his liberation eventually came, when everything seemed to him like a beautiful dream, so also the day comes when all his camp experiences seem to him nothing but a nightmare. The crowning experience of all for the homecoming man is the wonderful feeling that after all he has suffered, there is still nothing he need fear anymore except his God. Okay, so that is the beginning, or the end of section 1. And I only got a few minutes left to go, but something I want to point out in this chapter, I think, is the, just there are a couple of things mentioned, right, about the varying psychologies of a prisoner, right? You've got the how he is like before, during, and after, right? And this is a good point to make too. Something that's very common with suffering, trauma, things like that, and I think I've mentioned this before. There's always a period of shock, right? Like right as it's happening, because the body and the mind are trying to just figure out what's going on and how to respond, right? So the body's just kind of like frozen, like it's just, it's saying, hold up, wait a minute, like we need to really assess the situation because we can't figure out what is going on, right? And so it's very kind of reciprocal or identical when that suffering ends, especially, talking about the concentration camps, how it ended abruptly and suddenly without any sort of like preparation, right? It's the same thing, because the mind and the body have gotten used to that suffering, and they have, the mind and the body have gotten used to it, and they're again needing to take stock or inventory of what's actually happening. And Frankl mentions that, I think, in a really nice, really like good way, a good illustration of just, we were literally out, we were no longer in the camp, we were looking at the flowers that we had not seen for years, and it didn't mean anything, I think the average person might expect that like there would be some rush of emotion, or there would be some joy, there would be something. But the truth was, they had been conditioned to not feel joy, because joy was something that was punished, right? Joy was something that they weren't often rewarded for. And so not only were they not rewarded for it or often punished for it, but also they, had to learn to not like trust that. They had to learn to ignore it, right? Otherwise, any joy that they felt to whatever degree would be equaled in the disappointment that came afterward, right? And so, that's a pretty common thing too, right? That's a common thing in suffering. That's a common thing in mental health, depression especially, where it just, you get so used to things that are should be enjoyable, either not being enjoyable or somehow feeling like you are being punished for enjoying them, right? Emotionally, that it is necessary to kind of take a skepticism about it, and train yourself to not trust that, right? And so that's what these prisoners were experiencing, leaving the camp, because they truly could not trust that it was over, right? The way that the prison guards had, or the way that the SS, the Gestapo had treated them, was so was on such a level of horror, really, just in an indecent way, as Frankl would say, that they learned, they were essentially gaslit, into not trusting any of their emotions, right? Not trusting their emotions, and even though all signs pointed to them being free, not trusting that either, because there had been moments in the past where they believed there was going to be relief, and it just turned out to be a cruel prank, or a cruel torture by the SS, right? So, that's another thing too, and I'll tell you this too, just to relate this to something in present day. This happens a lot with combat veterans or soldiers who have just come back from a deployment, even soldiers who are coming back from basic training or boot camp, right? The experience, the emotional space, the emotional room that you have to create for yourself in training and in a deployment, where you don't have your family, you don't have your friends, and you're far away, and you don't have often all that much contact, with them. You have to reframe your emotions, and not only that, but experience of this 1% style experience of war, right, or combat, or even if you're not in combat, just being in this place of heightened discipline and having to be alert at all times because something could happen. Having to go through all of that and then come home to a world or a society that is, not, that just simply isn't the same at all, and much less to a degree of misunderstanding, right? Most civilians do not know what it's like to be in the military, because of how different it is, how different of a lifestyle, how different training it is, the different methods that are used to train soldiers, right? It's a similar feeling, right, where they come home, they may have spent their entire deployment looking for or hoping for the end of it, right? Because it's a situation that they may be totally in control of, but it's not their ideal situation, right? And there's a certain amount of suffering, right? Certain amount of sacrifice, certain amount of going without things that they normally have, right? And then when they come home, oftentimes they find that the world has continued on, right? The society has continued to just roll on by itself, with very little regard for the fact that they were just gone for 9 months, serving the country in a relatively traumatic way, right? Or at the very least, relatively jarring way. And so, that like compounded with just the sudden, and soldiers now know relatively when they're going home, so it's a little bit different than a prison situation, but there's still that sudden change, right? That sudden change of, okay, now we're home, and we don't need to be alert, we don't need to be hyper vigilant, we don't need to be ready to drop and roll into a combat situation, right? And it's hard to reconcile that, in a world where, like I said, there's not much need, back on the home front. And so that too, soldiers experience a similar sort of disillusionment when they come home, right? They may seem to be unable to enjoy things, and it's simply because, there was a certain amount of mental and emotional discipline they had to have to survive in a deployment setting, right? And now they don't need it, but their body hasn't caught on to that yet, right? And so, again, I think it's an important thing to note, that this isn't just something that happened within the war, within the concentration camps. This is something that still happens, right? Because the human body and the human brain has a relatively universal way of handling suffering, whether it is being a prisoner at a camp, or being on a deployment, or even just going away for a certain amount of time in some amount of service, right? Or being captive somehow, right? Like the human brain, the human body that will have that universal way of approaching a instance of suffering, whether it is a short-term or long-term amount of suffering, right? And so I think that's an excellent thing to point out. I would go on some more. I don't have much time. If you heard that little noise, that's my next client buzzing in. So I'm going to let you guys go. But we will talk more about this in the next chapter. Frankl will be getting into logotherapy, which is going to be really fascinating, I think, for everyone. So we'll get way more into this, as he explains his psychological theory and concepts more deeply. Cool. I'm going to let you guys go. Take care. Leave me some comments. Let me know. Give me some feedback. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video.